The forest basked in the gentle hush of early morning light. Dawn had just broken, and the tall conifers stood silent like watchful sentinels, their needles still shrouded in the pale mist that lingered from the cool night. Small creatures rustled in the undergrowth, going about their first foraging tasks of the day, while birds woke in a symphony of soft calls and fluttering wings. A stream meandered through the mossy floor, its waters clear and reflective in the dawn glow. The entire scene spoke of tranquility, a world slowly stirring to greet another day. Amidst this serenity, a lone bear shuffled through the dense ferns. He was large, with a powerful frame that hinted at long months spent roaming the wild. His coat bore hues of rich brown fading into a golden tinge around the neck and muzzle, as though kissed by years of sunlight. Muscles rippled under that thick fur, a testament to the primal strength that allowed a bear to thrive in such rugged terrain. He sniffed at the air, head tilting slightly as if listening for something beyond the reach of normal hearing. Unlike others of his kind, this grizzly moved with a curious, tentative gait. His head swiveled from side to side, ears high, while his snout twitched in an almost restless fashion. Where most bears would look with keen, dark eyes, this one did not look at all. His milky white eyes, clouded and unseeing, told the story of a bear living in perpetual darkness. He had lost his sight in an accident several seasons past. No one witnessed exactly how it occurred, but a terrible scar crossed his forehead, slashing down over each eye. Whether it was the result of a fierce fight with a rival bear, or a run-in with a hunter's trap, no one could say for certain. All that mattered now was that his world had become one of permanent night. Yet, he was here, still standing, still surviving. Hunger gnawed at his belly, as it did for all wildlife, especially with the changing seasons on the horizon. The forest was abundant in summer, but to a bear without sight, every day brought its own peril. The simplest tasks, such as sniffing out berries or fish, required heightened concentration and a reliance on senses other than vision. Slowly, he stepped forward, the pads of his large paws whispering against the damp earth. A gentle breeze stirred the tall grass and brought him a tapestry of forest scents. He picked them apart instinctively, the earthy musk of damp soil mixed with the sweetness of wildflowers. He caught the tang of nearby pine sap, the faint odor of a fox, and the familiar scent of water, a stream he knew was close. He might not see the morning light filtering through the branches, but every shift in the air, every scent riding on the breeze, gave him an ever-evolving map of the territory surrounding him. He ambled toward the burble of the stream. If luck was with him, small fish or crayfish might be foraging near the banks. Even blind, he knew how to detect the subtle vibrations that life made in the water. Over many months, he had honed his sense of touch, relying on the softness of the ground, the echo of footfalls, and the tiniest perturbations in the water's current. He was still learning, still adapting, but survival demanded nothing less. When he reached the stream, he paused, careful not to plunge in too quickly. One misstep in deeper waters could be fatal, if swift currents carried him away. His blindness would make it nearly impossible to orient himself. Instead, he waded in slowly, feeling the gravel under his paws shift. Once the water reached his knees, he stopped. A gentle splash told him a fish had darted by. He lifted his muzzle, ears pricked, and waited for another sign. The morning air felt cool against his wet fur. Time passed in silence, broken only by the soft gurgle of the stream and the occasional hum of insects near the bank. Fishing blind required immense patience. He had to hold his breath and wait for the subtle ripples of movement. Any thrashing, any misjudgment, and the fish would scatter. Soon, though, he sensed a disturbance upstream, a vibration that traveled through the water and up his legs. One fish, perhaps two, heading his way. He remained perfectly still, letting the current brush against his forelimbs. Then, with a sudden flash of motion, he lunged, powerful jaws snapping at the spot where he had felt that faint vibration. He missed. His paws churned up silt from the stream's bed, clouding the water. The fish panicked and shot away in a burst of speed. Frustration rippled through him, but he did not roar or flail. Instead, He resumed his statue-like stance, letting the silt settle, letting the forest calm around him again. Patience. He had learned that none of this would come easily. He had to rely on every sense except sight. A moment later, he felt the soft swirl of water near his hind leg. Another fish. This time, he inhaled deeply, capturing the scent of the fish's scales. It was faint, but as soon as he perceived it, he struck again, jaws parting in a smooth arc. He felt the slick shape contact his teeth. With a triumphant huff, he bit down and lifted a modest trout from the water. He trudged to the bank, fish still quivering in his jaws. It was not a large catch, but it was nourishment. His stomach growled impatiently as he tore into the flesh. Warmth spread through him as the fresh meal sated some of his hunger. The forest around him continued its awakening. A family of ducks called to one another in the distance, and a breeze rustled the aspens. He devoured his meal quickly, then sniffed around for any scraps that might have fallen to the ground. Satisfied, he rose, shaking water droplets from his coat. He could feel the sun's rays growing warmer on his back. Midday approached. He took a moment to rest by a cluster of ferns, crouching down so that his massive body rustled the leaves. Blindness made him more vulnerable to ambush by predators who would normally avoid a healthy grizzly. A pack of wolves might think differently if they realized he couldn't see. He couldn't allow himself to fall asleep for too long in an unprotected spot, but exhaustion tugged at his limbs, and he let himself doze lightly, trusting that his keen hearing would alert him to any encroaching danger. In half-sleep, his mind drifted. Before losing his sight, he had roamed these woods with an easy confidence, relying on powerful vision to find distant berry patches or to gauge the depth of a river with a mere glance. Memory was still vivid in him. Images of the bright glare of a summer sun, the shifting colors of autumn leaves. Now, all of that existed only in recollection. There were times when he missed it desperately, when he wanted to open his eyes and see the shapes around him instead of perceiving them as echoes, smells, and faint vibrations. But the forest's heartbeat still resonated with him. He could feel its pulse in the hush of the undergrowth, the subtle changes in wind direction. When he awoke fully, the sun was high overhead. He stretched, letting his long claws rake the ground beneath the ferns. Thirst beckoned him back to the stream. He drank deeply, the cool water soothing his throat. Then, guided by memory and scent, he set off in search of berries. He knew a stretch of land where wild blueberry bushes grew. If they were fruiting, he might gorge there, replenishing the energy he would need for the coming months. He navigated cautiously, using his sense of smell to track the sweet scent of ripe berries. Occasionally, he bumped gently into a trunk or a low-lying branch, but each slight misstep taught him something new about the lay of the land. He listened for the rustle of the breeze through shrubbery, identifying the distinct sound of leaf-laden branches bending under the weight of fruit. These subtle cues guided him. Step by step, he progressed deeper into the forest, sniffing the air. Before long, the sweet aroma of blueberries reached him in earnest. He found a bush, tested it with a careful paw, then dove in with an open mouth, lips parted to graze the clusters of berries. He munched greedily, savoring the burst of flavor. Juice trickled down his chin, and he snuffled in satisfaction. Here was an abundant food source, one that demanded little stealth or chase. He stayed at the bush for a good while, stripping most of its fruit. As he fed, he became aware of a shift in the environment. The birds had gone quiet. The breeze felt different. He lifted his nose. Beneath the fragrance of blueberries, there was a hint of something else, something animal, perhaps. He rose onto his hind legs, ears perked, muzzle tilted. His blindness made him vulnerable, but it also forced him to be hyper-attuned to every change. A twig snapped, faint but sharp in the distance. His heart rate quickened. In another moment, he heard a low, rumbling sound, a growl that resonated through the underbrush. Instinct flared inside him. Another bear, perhaps. Bears were generally solitary, especially grizzlies, and a meeting could spell trouble if territories overlapped or if there was a food dispute. He let out a deep, low noise, part warning, part question. Would the intruder back off, or would it challenge him? Silence stretched. Then the growl came again. Closer. He turned toward the sound, blind eyes wide, trying to pinpoint the exact distance. If it came to a confrontation, he would have to rely on brute strength and the advantage of surprise. But the intruder might already suspect he was blind. Animals read body language in ways humans did not fully understand. A bear that did not look at you, that used its ears more than its sight, might appear weak, and weakness could tempt aggression. He advanced a few steps, jaws parted, teeth bared. His imposing size often served as a deterrent. With a growl that seemed to rumble up from deep within his chest, he signaled that he was not to be trifled with. Sight or no sight, he heard movement, a shuffle of claws on soil, the crackle of leaves. Then, in a burst of sound, the other bear bounded away, crashing through shrubs in a chaotic scramble. Relief coursed through him, but he remained on edge, standing still until the forest settled back into its usual quiet. Once the intruder was gone, he lowered himself back onto all fours. The adrenaline that had flooded his system still pulsed in his veins. But the confrontation had ended without violence. That was a victory in itself. He returned to the blueberry bush to finish feeding, though he took frequent pauses to listen for any indication the other bear might return. It never did. He left the bush eventually, belly full, content that he had escaped another hazard of the wild. Over the next few days, he settled into a routine of cautious foraging. He found new berry patches, caught fish in calmer waters, and even managed to track down a fallen tree trunk where a beehive had once thrived. The hive was mostly abandoned, but a few remnants of wax and honey still clung to the comb. He devoured what little sweetness was left, ignoring the occasional sting from defensive bees. He was learning that the forest's bounty was abundant enough for him to survive, provided he remained aware of every risk and opportunity. Yet, danger was never far. One morning, as he was nosing through a patch of clover in a clearing, a distant howl echoed across the valley. Wolves. Their presence was not uncommon, but a blind bear could be seen as vulnerable prey if the pack was bold or starving. He remained frozen, ears angled forward to catch every note of the howling. The howls came in a rising chorus, a language of territory and hunting signals. The sound stirred something in him, a deep wariness. He had tangled with wolves before, though not since losing his vision. An encounter now would test his adaptations like nothing else had. He moved on, quietly and deliberately, putting distance between himself and the origin of the howls. The forest was thick in that area, which favored him. He kept near patches of dense vegetation where his bulk might remain somewhat hidden, or at least not openly exposed. His mind raced with possible strategies. Climb a tree? Risky, given his blindness. Fight if cornered? Yes, but he would need the element of surprise or a strong defensive position. 4 hours. He traveled in a wide arc, navigating the forest's slopes and gullies, hoping to circumvent any territory where wolves might be actively roaming. By late afternoon, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. The scent of wild mint hung in the air, and the ground felt softer under his pads. There was a slight downward slope, and he heard the rush of faster water in the distance, a river, perhaps bigger than the streams he was accustomed to. If that were true, it could be both a curse and a blessing. A large river might provide salmon during spawning seasons, but crossing it blind could be perilous. He ventured closer, guided by the deep roar of the water. The river's currents churned, and he could feel the cool spray on the breeze long before he reached the banks. When he arrived, the sound was thunderous, echoing off rock walls that lined a gorge. He stood at the edge, feeling the damp earth crumble beneath his front paws. Carefully, he backed away, sensing the drop. Indeed, it was a gorge or ravine. One misstep would send him tumbling into rapids he couldn't navigate. Exhaustion weighed on him. He needed a safe place to rest, perhaps a cave or a hollow beneath an uprooted tree. But first, water. Leaning as close as he dared to the gorge's rim, he found a trickle of runoff trickling down a slope of smooth stones. Lowering his massive head, he lapped at the water, which tasted fresh and cold. Once his thirst was satisfied, he retreated to find shelter. He followed the gorge's edge, moving slowly, whiskers brushing against the rough stone when the path narrowed. The drop below sent breezes swirling upward, carrying a wet, rocky scent that prickled his nose. Finally, he smelled damp earth and decay, the distinct aroma of rotting leaves thickly piled, as if in a natural depression. Investigating further, he discovered an area where the gorge wall curved inward, forming a shallow, cave-like recess. Fallen branches and old leaves created a soft bedding. It wasn't the most protected spot. Any large predator could sniff him out, but at least it offered some shield from the open forest. He cleared some debris and circled a few times, then settled onto the makeshift bedding. The day's travel had drained him. Usually, a bear might travel vast distances, but blindness required constant vigilance, which was mentally exhausting. The rhythms of the forest had become his only guide, and each new stretch of land demanded that he relearn everything: where the ground was uneven, which roots might trip him, and how close water or cliffs might be. Night fell, and the sky turned deep blue before fading into star-pierced black. He dozed fitfully, roused now and then by the distant yips of coyotes or the hoot of an owl. Sleep came in fragments, each segment filled with half-dreams of shadows and echoes. In one dream, he was a cub again, chasing fireflies in a meadow under the watchful eye of his mother. The colors were vibrant, the moon bright, and he could see every detail. Then he awoke to darkness, remembering his blindness, the scar over his brow, and the lonely gorge where he now sheltered. Morning brought a light rain, a gentle patter that soaked the leaves and made the rocks slippery. Hunger gnawed at his belly. He ventured out, muzzle raised, letting raindrops gather on his whiskers. The water soothed some of the dryness in the air, and the forest smelled alive, saturated with the scent of wet pine needles, damp moss, and fertile soil. He shook off some droplets clinging to his fur and began walking again, searching for a path that might lead to better foraging grounds. He found a narrow trail that wound away from the gorge, ascending slightly into denser forest. The ground here was spongy with layers of fallen needles, and the going was easier on his paws. As he progressed, he detected scents of mushrooms and other fungi that sprang up in the damp conditions. Sometimes, turning over a rotting log yielded a feast of grubs and insects. Not a bear's favorite delicacy, but a decent source of protein nonetheless. He paused at one such log, sniffing it intently. Sure enough, a cluster of beetles scurried underneath. With a swift swipe of his claws, he flipped the log, then lapped up what he could catch, savoring the crunch. Further along, the sound of dripping water mingled with a gentle breeze rattling the leaves overhead. He had wandered far from his usual range, but that also meant new possibilities. Unclaimed berry patches, and streams that might be teeming with fish. He took comfort in the knowledge that not seeing forced him to explore with heightened awareness. He found himself stopping to appreciate the subtle vibrations of water coursing underground, or the flutter of a bird's wings overhead, things he might have overlooked when he relied on sight. Still, the risk of encountering predators or even humans weighed on him. Humans, especially. He had caught their scent before, acrid, metallic, sometimes accompanied by smoke. He had heard the thunderous crack of what he now understood to be gunshots, though he had never personally been wounded by one. The scar across his face, however, was a reminder of the unpredictability of the forest and its perils. If humans caught sight of a blind bear, would they view him as a threat or a pitiable curiosity? He preferred to avoid them entirely, but that was not always in his control. The rains continued on and off throughout the morning, leaving everything slick and glimmering under the diffused sunlight. By midday, he stumbled upon a small clearing dotted with red berries. They weren't blueberries, possibly raspberries or salmon berries, judging by the tart, slightly sweet aroma. He carefully tested a branch with his teeth and discovered they were indeed raspberries. A bit overripe, the flavor burst across his tongue, and he devoured them eagerly, the juice staining his muzzle. He was so absorbed in feeding that he almost missed the subtle crunch of footsteps nearby. With a jerk, he raised his head, ears swiveling. The footsteps were light, perhaps from a smaller animal. His sense of smell soon confirmed it, a deer or a fawn. Maybe, He didn't detect the musty musk that indicated a predator, so he resumed eating, though more cautiously. Sure enough, after a few moments, he heard the gentle rustle of leaves as the creature wandered off. Day blended into evening. He found enough food to stay relatively sated, and no major threats revealed themselves. Such was the rhythm of his life. Constant scanning for danger, constant foraging, short rests, and endless adaptation. He navigated gullies, rocky ledges, and thick stands of trees, each obstacle a test of his senses. Through trial, error, and a growing confidence in the abilities that remained to him, he traveled farther than he ever had since losing his sight. Yet, within him, a spark of uncertainty flickered. Winter was not far off. The nights were getting cooler, leaves subtly changing hue. A bear's survival through winter depends on building enough fat reserves and securing a den for hibernation. Blindness made that more challenging. He had to find a safe location where he wouldn't be discovered or disturbed, a place where he could sleep through the cold months without fear of predators or sudden floods. Food was the first priority, but every day that passed brought him closer to the season of hibernation. If he didn't bulk up, he risked starving in his sleep or waking too early in a near-famine state. He pressed on, letting the scent of windfalls guide him. Occasionally, a storm or strong gust of wind caused fruit to drop prematurely from fruit-bearing shrubs and trees. He found some windfall apples near an abandoned orchard that had long since been reclaimed by the forest. They were mealy and bruised, but still edible. He devoured them, grateful for the sugars. One afternoon, while trekking through a pine-dominated region, he stumbled onto a new challenge, a beaver dam. He detected the pungent smell of beaver musk, wood chips, and stagnant water. The dam created a large pond, ringed by gnawed stumps and fallen trees. While it might harbor fish, crossing it blind posed a serious hazard. Yet, a curiosity drew him closer. Beavers, if present, might have inadvertently created deeper channels where fish gathered. He tested the water gingerly, feeling submerged logs beneath the surface. It was muddy, with an earthy odor. Finding stable footing was difficult. He ventured a few steps, then halted when his paw slipped against a mossy rock. A single misstep could plunge him into deeper water. He considered turning back, but hunger made him linger, hoping to detect fish or crayfish. Eventually, he heard a splash. Something had disturbed the water. It could be a beaver, or it could be fish swirling in the pond. He waited another step, carefully scanning vibrations with his feet. The water felt colder here, deeper around his chest. With heightened focus, he reached out with his muzzle, whiskers gliding across the water's surface. Then, a faint shift. A fish was indeed nearby. He struck with impressive speed, but the fish darted away, causing a commotion. Water splashed against his face, and for a few heartbeats, he struggled to keep his balance. He steadied himself, breath ragged, then tried again. Another swirl, another lunge, and this time his claws grazed something solid. A large fish, perhaps a carp. He swung his head down, attempting to bite, but it slipped free. A frustrated growl escaped him. He stood there, chest deep in water, reevaluating the situation. The mud on the pond floor made traction difficult. He was expending a lot of energy for uncertain gains. With a snort, he decided it wasn't worth the risk. Clambering back to the shore, he shook off and trudged away. Not every attempt at hunting could be successful, especially under these conditions. As evening settled in, the sky filled with a riot of color. Though he could not see the brilliant pinks and oranges, he felt the shift in temperature. The hush of twilight. A loon called from a nearby lake, its ghostly cry echoing across the water. He found a secluded nook among thick shrubbery, circled, and settled down to rest. Tomorrow, he would resume the endless quest for nourishment and safety, always guided by the forest's hidden cues. While he slept, the moon climbed higher, illuminating the forest with silver light. Had he been able to see, he would have observed the delicate dance of moths around moonlit petals and the gentle sway of tree branches in a soft breeze. Instead, he dreamed of darkness filled with faint echoes, the memory of once-seen silhouettes, and the warmth of summer nights. A quiet determination underpinned his every breath. Despite blindness, he would endure. He awoke at first light to the gentle stirring of leaves and the distant trill of a songbird. Cool morning air pressed against his fur, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. Everything in the forest still felt hushed, as though the world was holding its breath before bursting into the bustling activity of the day. He took in a slow, steady inhale, picking out the threads of scent that told him what might lie nearby. The dew, the wet moss, the faint musk of a rabbit that had passed in the night. Each element was a brushstroke on the invisible map he relied on to navigate his surroundings. He rose, shaking off debris that clung to his coat from the undergrowth where he had slept. His stomach rumbled softly, a reminder that survival hinged on finding food. Though he had nourished himself with berries and the occasional fish, he still had a long way to go before building up enough reserves for the approaching winter. The nights were gradually growing colder, and a subtle dryness in the foliage hinted at the changing season. The forest would provide, but he had to work harder than most bears to secure his share. He set off slowly, each paw step deliberate, where others might walk boldly, relying on sight to guide them. He treaded with vigilance, feeling for obstacles before putting his full weight down. He could sense the soil's softness in some places, where water pooled after the rains, and the roughness of tree roots that snaked across the forest floor. Occasionally, he brushed against fern fronds or thorny shrubs, wincing if he came too close to a sharp branch. But each misstep was a lesson in navigating a world he could not see. A few minutes of careful progress brought him to a shallow depression in the land, where water gurgled in a narrow creek lined with smooth stones. He recognized the fresh scent of running water and paused, muzzle tilted, listening to the gentle lap against the rocks. This creek was narrower than others he had encountered. Perhaps there were fish, though smaller, or maybe crayfish lurking in the shallows. He approached, letting his front paws sink into the water. The current brushed past his fur, and he could feel the creek bed's pebbles underfoot. He stood there for a while, sifting the vibrations that traveled with the flow. Every now and then, he picked up a faint movement, but it was far too small to be worth a big effort. He waded downstream, ears pivoting at the faint trickle of a waterfall not too far ahead. The rocky bed caused the water to tumble into miniature rapids, a sound that grew in intensity as he advanced. Soon, he reached a spot where the creek tumbled over a drop just a couple of feet high, forming a small pool below. This might be a place where fish paused before continuing upstream. If luck was with him, he could snag one or two. He braced himself on the edge of the drop, letting the water rush around his legs. The noise made it more difficult to pick out subtle sounds of fish movement, so he turned his head, focusing on the sense of water pressure. After a few moments, he felt a sudden swirl around his left paw, a telltale sign of something swimming against the current. He lashed out, claws slicing through the water. His paw grazed something slippery, but it darted away. Frustration welled up, but he stayed patient. He had learned that letting impatience take over would only scare off any remaining fish. He resumed his stance, snout lifted slightly, whiskers brushing the water's surface. Minutes passed, each second punctuated by the splash of the waterfall. Then, a new stirring. With a swift motion, he lunged once more. This time, his claws hooked into a wriggling body. He promptly pinned the fish to the rocky ledge and clamped his jaws around it. It was a small trout, but a welcome success. He backed away from the water to devour his catch on the creek bank. The fish's scales shimmered faintly in the early sun, though he could not see the glimmer. All he perceived was the cool morning air, the tang of fresh fish flesh, and the satisfaction that came with a hard-earned meal. After finishing, he licked his muzzle clean. He would have to search for more substantial fare later. Berries? Insects? Maybe a cache of nuts if he got lucky. But for now, the edge was taken off his hunger. A light breeze rustled through the canopy, carrying the distant caws of crows. He heard them squabbling, possibly over a carcass or some discarded scraps. The forest was full of opportunists, each trying to make the most of the resources before winter arrived. He decided to follow the creek downstream. Waterways often served as natural travel corridors for wildlife. and he might stumble upon other food sources or discover a new route away from potential predators. It didn't take him long to pick up on subtle changes in the creek's path. The ground beneath his paws grew rockier, and the current sped up, echoing off what felt like higher banks. The water's rumble deepened, suggesting a descent in elevation. The blind bear navigated by focusing on the echo of the rushing stream. Every step was tentative, but he kept moving. After a while, the air around him felt cooler and damper, as though he had entered a narrow ravine. The presence of sheer rock faces was evident from the way the water's sound reverberated back at him. Moss and ferns clung to these walls, their scent lush in the damp atmosphere. He brushed a paw against the stone, sensing how slick it was. One slip here could send him plunging into deeper currents. He discovered a ledge running parallel to the creek, its surface sloping down at a gentler angle. Carefully, he padded along it, occasionally testing the edge with his paw. The water roared a short distance below. After some time, the ravine opened into a more spacious setting. He heard the creek spread out, less forceful now, as if entering a broader valley. The air felt fresher, the wind carrying the fragrance of wildflowers. He descended a small incline, using his nose to detect patches of soft earth or protruding rocks. When he reached the bottom, he felt grass underfoot. It seemed like he had come to a level clearing where the creek meandered gently. The sun was higher now, warming his back. He paused to enjoy the moment, muzzle lifted, inhaling the varied scents. The forest no longer felt claustrophobic. Open space often meant better foraging prospects, especially if berries or fruit trees grew along the creek's edges. He meandered through the clearing, ears alert for movement, muzzle close to the ground to detect food. Occasionally, he found a patch of clover or wild onion shoots, nibbling at them to supplement his diet. Bears were omnivorous and could glean nutrition from a wide range of plants. He missed the convenience of simply spotting a berry bush and lumbering over for a feast. Now, every discovery felt like solving a puzzle, guided by smell and touch. As midday approached, the sun climbed overhead, casting shorter shadows that, for him, remained a mystery in darkness. A sense of restlessness stirred in him. Despite having eaten a small trout and some greens, he was still hungry. The coming weeks pressed on his mind. He needed to eat more. He also needed to find a secure place to spend the colder months. The mountains often provided ample dens, but climbing them would be fraught with risk. Another option was to find a large hollow log or a cave closer to lower elevations. He would have to choose soon. A shifting breeze carried an intriguing scent, a ripe, almost fermented fragrance that made his nostrils flare. It was sweet yet pungent, like overripe fruits. He followed the trail, lumbering with purpose. As he drew closer, the scent grew stronger, mixed with the odor of damp bark. He detected a faint buzzing noise, which piqued his curiosity. It wasn't the buzzing of bees. This was more erratic, uneven. Flies, perhaps, which often gathered around rotting fruit or carrion. He advanced slowly, feeling the ground slope upward. Then, he nearly stumbled over what felt like a large, gnarled root. He paused, sniffing vigorously. A fallen tree trunk lay partly hollowed out ahead, its interior damp and musty. The fermenting smell was definitely coming from within. Flies buzzed in a small cloud, their wings brushing against his fur as he neared. He reached out a paw, tapping the decaying wood. It felt spongy, riddled with holes. His nose led him to the opening, where he discovered a heap of partially decomposed fruits, apples, pears, and others, possibly dropped by birds or carried here by smaller animals seeking shelter. The fruit had rotted, forming a pulpy mass that exuded a sour-sweet aroma. Flies and beetles crawled over the surface. For a moment, he recoiled. This was not the fresh meal he usually preferred, but nutrition was nutrition, and the fermented sweetness might provide a quick burst of energy. He rummaged through the decaying fruit, picking out bits that were less spoiled. The taste was sharp and tangy, far from pleasant, but he tolerated it. He felt an odd lightness in his head as he ate. Fermented fruit could have mild intoxicating effects. He was careful not to consume too much. After a few mouthfuls, he backed away, letting the insects resume their feast. He snorted and shook his head, feeling a mild dizziness that soon passed. Continuing onward, he navigated the clearing's edges, hoping to find a place to rest that was safer than the hollow trunk. With the sun at its peak, many forest creatures were dozing in the shade, and the day took on a languid feel. He, too, felt the desire to lie down and digest, but caution nudged him to find somewhere more concealed. He soon discovered a thicket of interwoven shrubs and young saplings near the creek. It was dense enough to provide cover, yet open enough inside that he could curl up comfortably. He pushed through the outer branches, snapping a few twigs under his weight, and settled onto the soft ground. The faint trickle of the creek nearby soothed him as he slipped into a doze. Behind his closed, clouded eyes, images sometimes formed, fleeting memories of what the forest once looked like before the accident. Sunlit meadows, towering pines, the shimmer of a lake's surface. In sleep, he could see clearly, though waking brought darkness once again. When he roused from his rest, afternoon light had softened, and shadows had grown longer. His ears caught the rustle of small creatures, chipmunks or squirrels, skittering through leaf litter. Birds called to each other in the canopy. He remained still, listening, letting the forest speak. Sometimes, he gleaned valuable information from the sounds of animals. If they were relaxed, it suggested no large predator was around. If they suddenly fell silent or shrieked in alarm, it was wise to be on guard. Eventually, his hunger stirred again, and he rose to resume foraging. He moved in a wide arc around the clearing, drawn by the scent of more wild vegetation and possibly other fruit-bearing shrubs. He found a cluster of raspberries, their delicate fragrance distinct from blueberries. He nibbled on them, smiling inwardly at the sweet taste. A short while later, he overturned a log covered in moss and consumed a few worms and beetles that scattered beneath. It wasn't a glamorous meal, but every calorie helped. Dusk approached, painting the sky in hues he could only imagine. The temperature dipped, a subtle reminder of the seasonal shift. He decided to stay in this area for the night, given the shelter he had found, and continue exploring in the morning. If the food supply was decent, he might spend several days here. Yet, a small inner voice cautioned him that wolves or other threats could be near. He had to remain vigilant. Night fell, and the forest pulsed with nocturnal life. The calls of owls resonated through the darkness, while insects created a constant hum. Hidden in his thicket, he lay awake for some time, ears rotating at each distant snap of a twig. Eventually, fatigue overcame him, and he slipped into a deeper sleep, lulled by the natural lullaby of the wilderness. Morning arrived with a fresh breeze that carried the promise of mild weather. He emerged from the shrubs, stretching his sore muscles. Overnight dew coated his fur in fine droplets. He shook them off and tasted the air. No immediate threat called out to his senses, so he ambled toward the creek to quench his thirst. The water was colder now, tingling against his tongue. He roamed upstream, exploring a territory he had not yet examined. The banks were lined with cobblestones that shifted under his weight. Soon, the creek turned into a marshy area where reeds and cattails flourished. He had to tread carefully, sinking in mud if he wasn't mindful. Marshes could be dangerous for a bear without sight, but they also teemed with life: frogs, fish trapped in shallow pools, and maybe the occasional nest of bird eggs. He advanced gingerly, sniffing at the air to detect any carrion-like scents or signs of predators. A heron took flight a short distance away, its wings beating the air with a whoosh. He paused, listening to the bird's call fading into the distance. Then, he heard the distinct splash of something moving in a shallow pool to his left, possibly a frog or turtle. He waded closer, knee-deep in muddy water. The bottom felt uneven, clumps of vegetation tangling his paws. Another splash came, more vigorous. He braced himself and lunged, jaws clamping the water. He caught nothing but weeds. He steadied himself, ears flicking at the soft chorus of frogs. It was trickier to isolate a single target when the area was filled with echoing croaks. After a few failed attempts, he realized the effort might not be worth the energy expenditure. He backed out of the marsh, panting softly. The mud clung to his legs. and he shook it off with a frustrated grunt. As he emerged, he caught a different scent on the breeze, a warm, meaty smell, faint but unmistakable. Meat in the forest often meant either a fresh kill or the remains of one. Sometimes, it was too dangerous to investigate if the killer was still guarding the carcass. But the scent was compelling. He was a hungry bear. After all, he angled his muzzle, pinpointing the direction, and set off quietly, placing his paws with care. He followed the trail of scent through a patch of denser undergrowth until he reached a slight rise in the terrain. He crested it slowly, every muscle tense, ears alert for growls or movement. Yet, he heard only the hum of insects and the whisper of wind through branches. Proceeding a few steps further, he came across what felt like an old logging road, flattened earth, fewer rocks, and a faint smell of old machine oil in the dirt. Humans had worked here once, perhaps years ago. Grass and weeds now overtook the old tracks. To his right, the meaty scent intensified. He turned in that direction, descending a gentle slope. Suddenly, the smell of blood hit him, fresh and metallic, causing saliva to pool in his mouth. He pushed through a curtain of tall grass and froze. Even in blindness, he sensed he had come upon something significant. The air felt charged, as though conflict or violence had happened recently. He sniffed deeply, detecting deer fur, the scent of fresh entrails, and the pungent aroma of an animal that had been killed not long ago. But there was something else, a faint canine scent. Wolves had likely made this kill. He paused, hesitant. Wolves might be close, or they might have fed and gone. If they were still around, he was in grave danger, especially given his blindness. He stood there for a long moment, listening for the rustle of paws or the snap of jaws. Hearing nothing, he edged forward, sniffing the ground. Eventually, he located what remained of a deer carcass, partially devoured. The ribs were exposed, and the hindquarters were stripped. Much of the meat was gone, but some scraps clung to the bone. Normally, a bear might chase off smaller predators if the timing was right. But a blind bear had to be certain the pack wasn't just out of sight. A low cautionary growl rose in his throat. He stood still, ears pivoting. No sound responded. No movement signaled an approaching threat. Possibly the wolves had eaten their fill and left. He wanted to scavenge what remained, but his heart hammered at the possibility of an ambush. Hunger, though, urged him to take the risk. He lowered his muzzle and began tearing off bits of flesh that the wolves had missed. The taste was not fresh like a new kill, but it was far from rotten. Rich iron notes filled his mouth. He devoured what he could, pulling at sinews and licking marrow from cracked bones. Each mouthful replenished precious calories. He ate quickly, trying not to make too much noise, occasionally pausing to lift his head and scan for any change in the forest's ambience. Eventually, the carcass yielded no more edible scraps. He backed away, sniffing the air. The canine's scent lingered, but it smelled old, perhaps several hours or more. Satisfied that he had taken advantage of an opportunity without confrontation, he retreated, heading back the way he'd come. He thought about how precarious this existence was. In a world where sighted bears roamed confidently, he was forced into a life of near-constant caution. Yet he had survived this far, his entire being thrummed with determination. As he licked the last traces of blood from his muzzle, he considered whether it might be prudent to leave the area in case the wolves returned. The memory of their howls haunted him. He decided to keep moving. The afternoon wore on. He traversed gently sloping hills, skirting around rocky outcrops. Occasionally, he picked up scents of smaller mammals, raccoons, possums, or porcupines. He had no interest in tangling with a porcupine, whose quills could maim a sightless predator. Instead, he stuck to safer foraging, like berries, tubers, and the occasional insect trove. Late in the day, the sky thickened with the promise of rain. Clouds he could not see gathered, but the barometric pressure shifted, and a cooler breeze announced the impending storm. A distant rumble of thunder caused the ground to tremble faintly beneath his paws. He sought refuge, sniffing out a spot beneath a rocky overhang by following the scent of damp stone. Such shelter might spare him the brunt of the downpour. Thunder grew louder, and the forest creatures hushed as they often did before a storm. He found the overhang, testing the ground for dryness. The space was tight, but he managed to wedge his body under the protruding ledge. Rain began as a light drizzle, soon escalating into a downpour that drummed against leaves and rock. Lightning flashed, though for him it was only a distant crack of electricity followed by sharper thunderclaps. He lay there, shivering slightly each time the thunder boomed. Hours passed as the storm raged. Water spilled off the overhang in a curtain, and he remained mostly dry, though the chill of the wet air seeped into his bones. He dozed fitfully, too nervous to sleep deeply. A storm could bring flash floods, falling branches, and sudden surges in streams. By the time the rain finally tapered off, it was night. The forest glistened under a hidden moon. He ventured out, stepping into puddles that reflected the faint glow of starlight above. Everything smelled renewed, washed clean by the rain. He trudged on, searching for a safer resting spot. He found a soft patch of ground near a fallen birch where the bark was sloughing off in papery strips. He scraped leaves together, forming a makeshift bed. The sound of dripping water accompanied him as he settled down, and he exhaled in a long, weary sigh. The day had been fruitful enough. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges and a new search for sustenance. Dawn greeted him with a damp hush. The storm clouds lingered, and fog clung to the low ground. He rose stiffly, muscles protesting. The chill made his old scar ache, a deep throb that seemed to remind him of how he had lost his sight. He shook it off, literally shaking his head and shoulders, dislodging the droplets that still clung to his fur. He set out again, guided by an instinct that there must be better feeding grounds if he kept traveling. The forest felt different in the lingering fog. Sounds were muffled, and it was harder to pick out distant scents. Still, he relied on his memory of the terrain. Certain markers, like the angle of a slope or the distinct fragrance of a cluster of pines, helped him keep a rough sense of direction. The land began to climb steadily. He suspected he was heading into hillier country or the foothills of a nearby mountain range. Streams trickled down from higher elevations, and the plants grew more sparse in some places, replaced by sturdy shrubs that could handle the rugged terrain. Occasionally, he paused to snack on ground-level vegetation, though nothing substantial caught his nose. By midday, the fog had lifted, replaced by a brisk wind that carried a faint scent of evergreen resin. He navigated a narrow ravine where rock walls rose on either side. A small waterfall cascaded from a ledge above, landing in a shallow pool. He drank from it, enjoying the pure, cold taste of mountain runoff. The environment here felt quieter, more isolated, as though fewer animals inhabited these highlands. It also meant fewer close encounters, which was a relief. He continued climbing, each step purposeful. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his fur. The higher he went, the more he felt the temperature drop. He knew that if he ascended too far, winter conditions would arrive sooner and more harshly. The trade-off was that mountainous areas often had caves or natural shelters ideal for hibernation. His blind eyes would matter less once he settled in for winter's slumber, provided he built up enough fat reserves. The path steepened until he reached a ledge with loose gravel. His paws slipped, sending small stones skittering off the edge. The sound they made falling into nothingness put him on high alert. He pressed close to the rock face, testing each foothold. Progress was slow, nerve-wracking, but he found a way up, inch by inch. At last, he pulled himself onto a plateau of sorts, where the ground was relatively flat. He caught his breath, heart pounding from the exertion. The plateau felt wide, its surface scattered with boulders and patches of scraggly grass. The wind carried a piney scent, suggesting a cluster of conifers somewhere nearby. He could also smell the faint aroma of small animals, marmots or ground squirrels that often lived in rocky areas. He paused to rest behind a large boulder, letting his racing heart settle. While he rested, a memory surfaced. As a cub, he had ventured high into the mountains with his mother, seeking berries that grew in alpine meadows. The air had been crisp, the sun bright. Now, he felt only the cold wind and the rough texture of stone against his fur. Yet, he clung to that memory, a reminder that he had once roamed this kind of terrain without fear. If a younger version of himself could do it, then so could he. Blindness notwithstanding, his rest complete, he searched for signs of a water source. The dryness of the plateau worried him. Bears typically needed a reliable water source for drinking and foraging. He sniffed around, picking up a faint scent of dampness that might indicate a spring. Moving with care, he navigated the boulder-strewn ground. Eventually, he heard the trickling sound of water dripping between rocks. A small seep, no more than a trickle, but enough to quench his thirst. He lapped at the water, savoring its coolness. As afternoon waned, he realized he should look for shelter. Nights in the mountains could be brutally cold, especially for a bear still months from hibernation. The temperature drop stung the sensitive skin of his nose. He pressed on, following the plateau's edge, feeling with each paw step. A scattering of pine needles told him he was nearing a grove of conifers. That was good news. Pines offered cover, and sometimes their roots formed hollows where an animal might bed down. He entered the grove, ears perked for any unusual sounds. The scent of resin was strong, and the ground was covered in a thick carpet of needles, muffling his movements. Here and there, he felt the terrain rise in gentle mounds or dip into shallow depressions. He found a large pine with exposed roots that formed a natural alcove. Curious, he investigated, pressing his snout under the twisting roots. The space was cramped, but could provide some protection if he curled up. He made a note of it as a potential sleeping spot. Before deciding to settle, he explored a bit deeper into the grove. The air here was still, shielded from the gusts that scoured the plateau. He heard the flutter of wings overhead, a bird taking flight. Then, a new scent reached him, a sharper animal musk, akin to a mountain goat or perhaps a young elk that had wandered up from lower elevations. Intrigued, he followed it. If an elk was resting or if it had died, that could mean a larger meal. But he also had to be wary. Any large herbivore could fight back if cornered, and a blind bear had little margin for error. He trailed the scent cautiously until he arrived at a spot where the pine grove thinned, and jagged rocks formed a low cliff. He sniffed around, detecting fresh droppings that belonged to some ungulate. The musk was strong, so whatever creature left it couldn't be far. He remained still, ears searching for hoofbeats or snorts, but heard nothing. Possibly it had moved on. He pressed forward another dozen steps, and then the drop-off made itself clear in a sudden rush of open air. He stopped just in time, feeling the edge crumble. Pebbles rattled down a steep slope. Carefully, he backed away, unwilling to risk a blind descent. Disappointment mingled with relief. He wouldn't find that ungulate easily, and trying to follow it in this terrain might lead to a disastrous fall. He turned around, heading back to the pine with the exposed roots. By now, dusk was painting the sky, an event that meant nothing but a gradual cooling of air to him. He was tired from the day's climb and the stress of finding his way. The root alcove beckoned as a safe haven for the night. He reached the tree, cleared some needles with his massive paws, and curled up as best he could beneath the arching roots. The scent of pine pitch was soothing, and he felt more secure than he had in some other shelters. The darkness behind his closed eyelids was the same as always, but his ears took in the quiet rustle of the breeze high in the canopy. He let his weariness envelop him. Dreams came in fleeting images, glimpses of a sunlit forest floor, a salmon leaping up a waterfall. In the dream, he could see every detail, the droplets of water sparkling in the sunlight. Then his subconscious reminded him of reality, and the image dissolved into swirling shades of gray. He slept fitfully, half aware of the wind's moan around the trunk of the pine. Morning arrived with a crisp bite to the air. He emerged from beneath the roots, muscles stiff, joints aching slightly from the cold. A thin layer of frost coated the ground, which startled him when he touched it. He realized the high altitude meant winter came early. As soon as the sun climbed, the frost would melt, but it was a warning of harsher weather yet to come. He licked at the thin crust of ice, quenching a bit of thirst. Then he ventured away from the grove, moving carefully across the rocky plateau. The sky felt brighter. Sun rays warmed his fur, though the wind remained chilly. He decided it was unwise to go higher. He had better chances of finding abundant food in lower elevations. Maybe once he had gorged more, he could return to find a den, or perhaps he'd discover a suitable spot somewhere down the mountain. Either way, the immediate priority was to eat as much as possible. Descending blind was trickier than climbing, as each step could propel him forward if he lost his footing. He took it slow, testing each ledge with a paw before committing his weight. A misplaced step sent his heart hammering when pebbles dislodged underfoot and tumbled down the slope. The sun rose higher, warming the stones, reducing the slipperiness. Bit by bit, he made progress, eventually reaching gentler terrain where the pines and firs stood tall in thick clusters. He paused to rest in the shade of a fir tree, sides heaving. The journey down had been nerve-wracking, and he still had a ways to go. The forest below beckoned with the promise of streams, berries, and possibly carrion. Another meal from a wolf kill might be a stroke of luck. Though dangerous, he weighed his options. He could keep traveling, or find a place to fish in the streams that flowed around the mountain's base. Thirst nudged him to search for water. He followed the faint sound of trickling, which led him to a small rivulet flowing down a gulch. The water wasn't deep enough for large fish, but it was crisp and refreshing. He drank his fill, then continued downhill until the gulch opened onto a broader slope covered with deciduous trees, aspens, and cottonwoods. Their leaves were starting to turn color, some fluttering to the ground. He picked one up in his mouth, tasting the bitter tang of autumn. Change was in the air, and time was running short. The blind bear pressed forward, drawn by the possibility of late-season berries that sometimes clustered around forest edges. He sniffed out a few huckleberry bushes, though they were nearly stripped by birds and smaller mammals. Still, he found enough to nibble on. He moved along, checking any bush or bramble that caught his nose. Occasionally, he growled in annoyance at how little was left. It seemed every forest dweller was gathering what they could before the freeze. Eventually, a stronger scent of running water reached him. This time it was more robust, likely a stream or small river. He made his way toward it, stepping out from under the shadow of the trees. Ahead, the sun felt brighter, and the air carried the freshness of open water. He could almost picture the glint of sunlight on a wide, rippling surface. If it was shallow enough near the bank, he might have a chance at fishing. He approached cautiously, feeling the ground transition from leaf-strewn soil to firmer gravel near the water's edge. The stream was moderate in width, perhaps wide enough to demand careful wading. He tested it with a paw. The current was steady but not too swift. The water rose to his elbows as he advanced. The bed felt mostly gravelly, though occasional rocks shifted beneath his weight. He steadied himself, listening to the burble of the stream. Here, he might wait for fish to pass if they were migrating upstream. He recalled that certain fish runs happened in autumn. Even blind, he could capitalize on them if he was patient. He positioned himself in a shallow section, focusing on the tension in the water that would signal a fish's approach. Hours slipped by. Occasionally, he sensed minor disturbances, small fish or drifting debris, but the sizable catch he longed for did not appear. Finally, he opted to move downstream, hugging the bank in hopes of stumbling on a better fishing spot. He trudged through a stretch of overgrown reeds, weaving between them. The reeds hissed as they brushed against his flanks. Suddenly, the current shifted around him, a deeper pool. Perhaps. He paused, straining to detect any fish. Moments later, a subtle flick in the water told him something was near his right paw. He lashed out, claws slicing the current. Empty. Another swirl. Behind him this time. He spun too late, missing again. Frustration flared. Eventually, a fish made the mistake of passing close to his snout. He snapped his jaws, feeling the slick body connect. He bit down, hauling it halfway out of the water. The fish thrashed violently, slipping free in a spray of droplets. He roared in anger, slapping the surface with both paws. Waves radiated outward, scattering any remaining fish. Defeated, he sloshed back to the bank, water dripping from his fur. He spent the rest of the late afternoon scavenging along the shoreline. He found a few crustaceans under rocks, prying them free with careful claws. He swallowed them quickly, shells and all. ignoring the gritty texture. He also sniffed out a dead amphibian, partially decomposed, but decided it was too far gone even for his standards. As dusk approached, the blind bear felt a gnawing disappointment. Food was growing scarce, and he hadn't made the big catches he'd hoped for. Still, he had eaten something, and that would have to be enough. He made his way to higher ground, away from the stream's edge, eventually finding a cluster of young spruce trees. The soft, springy ground beneath them was layered with needles. He sank down there for the night, hoping that tomorrow might bring better luck. Morning found him stiff and cold once more. The nights were cooler now, undeniably so, and a faint layer of frost coated the low-lying areas. He realized with growing concern that he needed a long-term plan. Wanderers did not always fare well in winter, especially a blind wanderer. Bears typically spent weeks, even months, digging out dens or searching for perfect spots under uprooted trees or rocky overhangs. He had to start that search in earnest or risk being caught unprepared when the snows arrived. Yet, he still needed more body fat. He rummaged for more berries, overturning logs to find insects. On this morning, luck favored him slightly. He discovered a fallen tree trunk riddled with termites. Tearing at the rotted wood, he unearthed a trove of them, each mouthful a crunch of protein. He ate his fill, ignoring the sour taste. It wasn't a salmon run or a stash of honey, but it would help. Afterward, he turned his thoughts to finding a den. He started traveling along the stream, scanning the bank for rock formations or large hollow logs. Occasionally, he climbed the slope that flanked the waterway, feeling for any crevices. The hours passed in this manner, with him pausing to rest or to snag whatever small morsels came his way. He spooked a family of ducks at one point, sending them fluttering upriver in panic. He sighed, frustrated. Waterfowl were too quick and agile for him to catch without sight. By late afternoon, he stumbled on a promising area, a sloping hillside dotted with boulders. The soil here had been eroded in parts, creating small caves and overhangs. He sniffed around, carefully poking his head into each hollow. Some were too small. Others smelled of recent animal activity, a fox or a bobcat. Perhaps. He didn't want to intrude on a den that was already claimed. Finally, he found a larger opening near the base of an ancient pine. The tree's massive roots curled around the mouth of a shallow cave, as though nature herself had sculpted a bear-sized hollow. He sensed no fresh animal scent inside. Carefully, he squeezed through the entrance, using his paws to feel around. The interior was damp and smelled of earth and decay, but it was roomy enough to turn around. He noticed a slight draft, which might be good for ventilation, though if winter winds blew directly inside, it could be a problem. He decided to mark the location. Backing out, he scraped his claws against a nearby trunk, leaving deep gouges. He rubbed his scent along the bark, hoping it might deter other creatures from moving in. For now, he would keep searching, in case there was a better option. But if not, this cave could serve as a fallback. He spent the rest of the daylight hours exploring the hillside, stepping gingerly over exposed roots and rocky outcrops, but he found nothing more suitable. Night settled again, and the sky was clear, the air crisp. He claimed a spot not far from the cave entrance for sleep. The hillside slope helped him feel more secure, as he could quickly retreat to the cave if threatened. Wind rustled through the branches overhead. The chorus of crickets and the distant hoots of an owl reminded him that the forest was alive with unseen activity. He dozed, curling his body tight to conserve warmth. The next several days followed a similar pattern. Each morning, he foraged for berries or insects, occasionally scoring a small fish. He continued patrolling the hillside, testing other nooks and crannies, but always returning to that cave by dusk. Gradually, he began preparing it. He used his powerful limbs to move loose stones from the floor, to dig out a slightly deeper pit near the back. He gathered layers of dry foliage, leaves, pine needles, grasses, to create bedding. It was not as elaborate as a sighted bear's den might be, for he had to operate slowly and by feel. But bit by bit, he shaped it into a tolerable space. One evening, as he added another mound of dried leaves to his makeshift bed, a cold wind swept through the forest. howling across the hillside. He heard branches clacking and felt a hint of moisture in the air. The first snows might not be far off. He crawled into the cave's recesses, curling up in his improvised bedding. Despite the unyielding darkness that claimed his vision, he felt a small measure of comfort. For the first time since losing his sight, he had a place that truly felt like home. Outside, clouds veiled the stars, and the temperature dropped further. He felt it in his bones, a deep ache that suggested winter's imminent arrival. His store of body fat was not yet ideal. He wondered if he could push a bit longer, foraging further afield, or if that risked traveling too far from the den. He had heard stories, passed in the wind, one might say, of bears who waited too long, caught in sudden storms, forced to wander in deep snow. For a blind bear, that would be deadly. He resolved to hunt near the den, focusing on any last-minute opportunities. Perhaps a late-season salmon run would pass through the nearby streams, or he might encounter scavenging chances. The next morning, he set out in a widening spiral from the den site, sniffing for fresh sign of deer, elk, or anything that could provide a large meal. The hillside, however, was mostly silent. He found a few more termite-infested logs, a leftover patch of berries, and plenty of dried grasses, not exactly prime fare. His wanderings led him to a break in the trees where he could detect the faint roar of a bigger waterway at the base of the slope. If salmon or trout were migrating, that river could offer a final feast. Carefully, he descended, bracing his body against saplings when the slope became steep. The roar grew louder, echoing off the valley walls. The air felt cooler, charged with the energy of running water. At last, he reached flatter ground and smelled the moist aroma of a wide river. This could be the best chance he had to stock up. He approached the bank with caution. The current was strong, and the shoreline was littered with fist-sized rocks. He felt them shift under his paws, threatening to make him stumble. The river's thunder suggested deeper channels. If salmon were running, they might attempt to leap certain spots or rest in eddies. He scouted up and down the bank by scent, searching for places where fish might gather. All the while, he listened for potential predators. Large rivers were also favored by other bears, cougars, or wolves. After considerable probing, he discovered a spot where the river eddied behind a small boulder. The current slowed there, forming a pool. If fish were swimming upstream, they might pause in such a calm area to catch their breath. He lowered himself into the shallows, water swirling around his legs. A gritty bottom of pebbles met his paws. He inched deeper until the water reached his chest. Jaws parted to sense the slightest vibrations. The sun crawled across the sky, but he endured in the water, occasionally shifting positions. Hunger gnawed at him, fueling his patience. Once or twice he sensed faint movements, but no decisive chance presented itself. At last, late in the afternoon, the water rippled with sudden energy. A school of salmon or trout must have moved through. He felt a bump against his flank and reacted instantly, swiping his paw in a powerful arc. His claws met solid flesh. A startled fish thrashed, and he secured it in his jaws. Biting down hard, he waded to the shore, clutching his prize. It was a hefty salmon, large enough to make a real difference in his caloric intake. He tore it open, eating the meat, the skin, and even the nutrient-rich eggs that spilled from within. The taste was glorious, the best meal he had enjoyed in weeks. He devoured every morsel, leaving little for scavengers. Blood stained the rocks, but he cared only for the satisfaction of sating that desperate hunger. As evening settled, a chill wind blew across the valley. He dared to remain near the river, hoping for another fish. Lady Luck shone upon him once more, though smaller. He managed to catch a second salmon just before dusk. With a grateful huff, he dragged it ashore and feasted again. His stomach felt fuller than it had in a long while. The blind bear rumbled in contentment. If such runs continued for a few more days, he might pack on enough weight to face the winter with confidence. He realized staying out in the open overnight was risky, but the lure of more salmon was too strong. Instead of returning to the hillside den, he found a sheltered spot among driftwood and tall reeds a short distance from the water. He pawed together a rough bedding of reeds, then curled up, nose tucked under his paw. The river sang its perpetual, rushing lullaby. He drifted off into an exhausted sleep, dreaming of shimmering fish and a warmth that spread through his entire body. Morning brought a pale sky and a lingering cold. He rose, muscles stiff, stepping gingerly on the rocky shore. The plan was simple: fish again, eat his fill, and return to the den to ready himself for winter. If fortune truly smiled, he might catch enough salmon in the next few days to make a decisive difference. He waded into the same eddy, bracing himself against the flow, listening and feeling for the next wave of fish. Hours passed. He managed one catch in the early morning, a modest trout. The rest of the day's attempts proved fruitless. Even though he stayed immersed longer than was comfortable, the chill seeped through his fur, numbing his limbs. Finally, he realized the run might have moved upstream, or perhaps the main pulse of fish had already passed. He decided not to push his luck further. He had gained something from the salmon he had caught, but it was not the feast he'd hoped for. Resigning himself, he clambered onto the bank, shaking water from his coat. The sun was hidden behind gathering clouds, threatening another cold front, or possibly snow. He aimed his muzzle toward the hills, where his newly prepared den awaited. Navigating the slope took considerable energy, his limbs worn from hours in the frigid river. By the time he reached the mouth of the cave, twilight had fallen. He slumped inside, too weary for more than a few cursory licks at his damp fur. Sleep claimed him almost immediately. When he stirred at dawn, the world outside felt subdued. He crawled to the cave entrance and stuck his snout into the open air, inhaling the sharp tang of frosty wind. A hush blanketed the forest, as though every creature was bracing for winter's arrival. He stepped out onto the hillside, and his paw met something cold and soft. Snow, just a light dusting, but enough to confirm the season had turned. Snow in the highlands was not unusual this early, but it underscored how little time remained. He needed to decide whether to stay put and begin the long hibernation process or risk traveling elsewhere for more food. His body yearned for rest. Hibernation was a natural cycle for bears, enabling them to survive winter's scarcity. Yet he couldn't shake the nagging worry that he might not have enough stored fat to survive. Blindness had slowed his foraging, and the salmon run might be too short to save him. With a low grunt, he surveyed his inner reserves. His belly felt no longer hollow, but the extra layer of fat he wanted to feel around his midsection was not quite there. He had options, though few. He could try returning to lower elevations, where autumn might linger a bit longer, hoping to find more food. But that meant leaving behind this cave, one of the few promising dens he had encountered. If he ventured far and failed to find food, returning in deeper snow would be perilous. He lingered by the entrance, indecisive, until hunger pangs suggested at least a small breakfast was in order. He ambled downslope a short distance, snuffling through the light snow. Fallen leaves and pine needles still littered the ground beneath the thin white veil. He dug with his front paws, uncovering dormant insect colonies. After a few tries, he managed to scrape up a handful of sluggish grubs or beetles. Not exactly a feast, but enough to keep him going. As midday neared, the sun peeked through the clouds, melting some of the snow. Water trickled down the slope, forming rivulets in the loose soil. He decided to expand the interior of his den, digging deeper into the earthen wall if possible. That might generate extra space for insulation and keep the cold wind at bay. For the next few hours, he toiled inside, using his powerful limbs to claw out dirt and loose stones. He piled the debris near the entrance, then rearranged his bedding of leaves and pine needles, making the nest thicker. The effort left him panting, but also gave him a sense of purpose. He was creating a sanctuary, a place that might shelter him through the bleak months. As he worked, he thought of the forest beyond. Wolves, cougars, and other bears would soon adapt to the new season as well. He wondered if that one rival bear he had encountered near the berry patch months ago was already snug in some cavern, or if it too roamed, searching for a final meal. By late afternoon, he emerged, muzzle coated in dirt, fur speckled with dust. He shook vigorously, sending a small cloud of earth into the air. The hillside glowed in the waning sunlight. He realized the sky had cleared, offering a crisp, golden radiance. He drank in the moment, the warmth on his back, the mild breeze carrying the scents of pine and distant snowfields. It might be one of the last truly pleasant afternoons before winter's grip tightened. He took a short walk around the vicinity to see if any other food might be scrounged up. The pickings were slim. Most berry bushes were stripped bare. Insect activity was waning, and any small game stayed well hidden. As dusk approached, the temperature plummeted again. He returned to the cave, crawled inside, and nestled into the thick bedding. A deep weariness settled over him, deeper than usual. Perhaps his body was already signaling the onset of hibernation mode. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Snow fell in lazy flakes, coating the hillside once more. He poked his head out to find the world hushed by winter's first real storm. He retreated, feeling the chill in his bones. Hunger was still there, but so was the pull of a long sleep. A bear's metabolism would slow in hibernation, living off stored fat. If he had miscalculated and didn't have enough reserves, he might starve before spring. But continuing to wander in increasing snow, blind and vulnerable, posed its own fatal risks. Ultimately, nature's instincts won out. He sensed the shift in his physiology, his body preparing for dormancy, heart rate dropping slightly, movements growing lethargic. He rearranged the bedding one final time, making it as comfortable as possible. Then he settled into the far end of the den, curled up, and let his breathing deepen. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the forest in white silence. As the days passed, he sank deeper into hibernation. His breathing became slow and rhythmic, his heart rate a fraction of its usual pace. The den grew dark and still. Occasionally, he shifted or half-woke to adjust his position, but mostly he drifted in a realm of slumber, where time lost its meaning. Dreams flickered behind his clouded eyes, memories of color, scenes of running streams, the shapes of trees, and the feeling of sunlight. These images visited him as if to remind him that once he had seen the world in all its splendor. Outside, winter reigned. Snowstorms came and went. Winds howled across the mountain slopes, piling drifts at the cave entrance. Wolves roamed far below, following herds that migrated to lower valleys. Nights stretched long and cold. Yet within the den, the blind bear remained safe in his cocoon of earth and leaves. Nature had granted him this reprieve, a season of rest to gather strength, to hope that he had eaten enough to survive until the thaw. Time rolled on without measure, each day blending into the next. He seldom stirred. When he did, it was a fleeting awareness, a vague sense that the air might be warming, or that his bedding needed a slight adjustment. But mostly, he slumbered, mind drifting through the darkness of blindness and the hidden realm of dreams. Eventually, subtle changes began to occur. The soil near the den's entrance felt wetter, the air slightly milder. Ice melted, trickling inside in tiny rivulets. Spring was on the horizon. Though the forest was still locked in snow, he remained dormant a while longer, unwilling to wake fully until the signals of changing season were undeniable. Hunger gnawed at him occasionally, but his body was still in a slowed metabolic state, drawing on precious fat stores. One day, he roused to the drip-drip sound of melting snow. He lifted his head, ears twitching. His muscles felt weak from disuse, and his stomach cramped with a sudden, intense hunger. The urge to leave the den and find food began to outweigh the desire to stay in the warm bedding. With a groan, he shifted, testing his stiff joints. Pain flared through limbs that had been mostly idle for months. But movement also brought a sense of renewed possibility. He dragged himself toward the entrance, pushing aside the debris that had accumulated. Sunlight hit his face, surprising him with its warmth. He blinked his unseeing eyes, muzzle lifted to greet the open air. It smelled of fresh water, thawing earth, and faint green shoots. Spring was not fully realized yet. Chilly patches remained, and snow lingered in shady spots. But the forest was coming alive again. He emerged slowly, legs trembling under his weight. His fur, once thick and healthy, looked a bit ragged in places, matted from weeks of disuse. He shook vigorously, dislodging clumps of dirt and hair. Then he took a step forward, sniffing at the ground. The hillside was muddy, and rivulets of meltwater ran down the slope. He lapped at one, quenching a desperate thirst. The water was cold and revitalizing. Hunger slammed into him like a physical blow. He needed to eat berries, shoots, insects, carrion, anything. With a determined huff, he started down the slope, each step shaky but growing steadier. His blindness was as absolute as ever, but his other senses had not dulled in hibernation. If anything, they felt heightened. The new season carried vibrant scents, budding plants, warming soil, occasional animal traces. He moved slowly, feeling out each step on the slick ground, searching for something to fill his belly. He reached a patch of slushy snow and stepped carefully, mindful that ice might lurk beneath. His claws dug in, providing some stability. Before long, he came across a tangle of bushes that exuded a pungent, onion-like odor. Wild ramps or onions, perhaps. He nibbled at the emerging shoots, their sharp flavor a welcome jolt to his system. It wasn't the hearty meal he craved, but it was food. He devoured what he could find, moving from clump to clump. The patches were scattered, so it took time, but gradually he felt a glimmer of energy returning. He continued downhill, the forest opening up around him. Patches of exposed ground alternated with snowdrifts. Streams were swollen with meltwater, cascading in bright rivulets. Birds sang overhead, celebrating the season's change. He navigated toward the sound of flowing water, guided by the hope that fish might gather in these warmer currents. Though still cold, the streams offered potential. He waded into one shallower section, feeling the rush of meltwater around his legs. It was frigid, jolting him fully awake. He waited, listening for any sign of fish, but the water churned past with no hint of movement. Possibly it was too early for a run, or the fish were in deeper channels, waiting until the water temperature rose. Desperate for protein, he began to prowl the banks for any winter-killed animals that might have washed downstream. Winter could be harsh, and deer or elk sometimes died from starvation or injury, leaving carrion in the early spring. Eventually, the blind bear's nose detected the faint smell of something animal-like. He followed the scent, stepping over fallen branches and muddy debris until he located a half-submerged deer carcass caught in a logjam. The deer had likely died up in the mountains and been carried by meltwater currents. He lunged for it, hooking his claws into the decomposing remains. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't rotted completely either. Strips of flesh and muscle still clung to the ribs. He hauled it onto the bank, then tore into it with ravenous vigor. The taste was unpleasant, partly waterlogged, partly decayed, but he forced it down, desperate for nourishment. A few mouthfuls gave him renewed strength, though he remained wary of the potential for disease or parasites. Sometimes, a starving bear had no choice but to take such risks. Once he had eaten what he could stomach, he backed away, leaving the remnants for scavengers. He already felt more alert, though the painful emptiness in his belly lingered. He knew that spring foraging would be a race against time, as the forest's bounty would take weeks to fully awaken. He had to keep moving, keep searching, until he found richer feeding grounds. He trailed along the stream, heading toward lower elevations where green-up might be further along. The terrain leveled out, and signs of spring multiplied. Willow buds, young grasses near the water, and occasional wildflowers poked through the melting snow. He ate whatever plant matter he could find, though these fresh shoots lacked the caloric density he truly needed. Days blurred together in a cycle of constant foraging. He roamed meadows that were just beginning to show tufts of green. He tore apart down logs, hoping for insect larvae, and sniffed for any sign of leftover acorns or nuts from the previous autumn. He found precious few, as squirrels and other rodents had depleted most caches to survive the winter. Every so often, he came across fresh deer or elk droppings, indicating that herds had returned to graze on the new growth. That gave him hope. If a weak or injured individual fell behind, or if a predator's kill was left partially uneaten, he might scavenge a decent meal. At night, he slept in sheltered spots, under overhangs, within dense thickets, or even in shallow depressions he scraped out. He never strayed too far from water, The meltdown was in full swing, and rivers ran high with frothy currents. The roar of water was a near-constant backdrop. Some nights, rains came, drenching him before giving way to cold dawns. He endured, one paw step at a time. Gradually, his persistence paid off. The forest continued its transformation. More plants sprouted, insects hatched in abundance, and small mammals became more active. He gorged on termites, ants, and grubs, supplementing with early berries where he could find them. One afternoon, to his great delight, he stumbled on a hidden patch of skunk cabbage by a swampy area, a pungent plant that nonetheless provided nutrition. He tore at the broad leaves and tubers, ignoring the foul odor. After several weeks of this springtime hustle, he felt himself gaining some stability. His ribs no longer protruded so sharply, and his fur developed a healthier sheen. He was still blind, of course, but each day made him more adept at navigating a landscape bursting with new life. He remained cautious of predators. Wolves or cougars might see a blind bear as an easier target. Yet so far, he had encountered none. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in subtle tones he could only sense through temperature changes, he found himself near a stand of aspen trees. The breeze stirred the young leaves, creating a soft rustle that soothed his ears. He lay down among the newly grown grasses, feeling the earth's gentle warmth beneath him. A moment of calm washed over him. He had endured a harsh winter, survived without his eyesight, and was now part of the forest's cycle of renewal. His life would never be easy. Danger, hunger, and the constant challenge of navigating the unknown would remain. But he had learned to fish by sensing water vibrations, to seek out berries by their sweet fragrance, and to scavenge effectively. He had adapted. The memory of color, shape, and sunlight would never truly return. But in their place, he had gained a deeper bond with the textures, scents, and rhythms of the wild. In that quiet dusk, a gentle resolve settled in his heart. He would continue to roam, to find sustenance, to build his strength for the next winter. The forest had tested him, reshaped him, but also cradled him in its vast embrace. Blind though he was still a grizzly, a being of raw power and ancient instincts. He was alive, part of the endless dance of seasons, each day a chance to grow stronger, wiser, and more in tune with the hidden tapestry of the land. He rose, sniffing the air, sensing the faint promise of wildflowers on the breeze. With a slow, steady gait, he moved forward into the gathering twilight. Darkness no longer held the same terror it once did. He carried it within himself, and in its place, he had found new ways to perceive, to understand, and to survive. And so the blind bear walked on, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. That night, the wind whispered through the aspens, as though congratulating him on another day well lived. The moon rose behind a veil of clouds, unseen by him but present in the sky, a glowing witness to the perseverance of all wild creatures. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, and a chorus of frogs answered from the marshes. Life pulsed in every direction, and though he could not see it, he felt it in every fiber of his being. He had learned to hunt without eyesight, to exist in a world of scents and vibrations. This was his domain now, and in it, he was not lost but profoundly, deeply at home.